Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette, number 123. 123. This episode brought you by the number 123. Philosophy Roulette is where we get some philosophy, academic philosophy off the internet, and read and review it live. Please join me in reading some stuff. Sometimes it's interesting, sometimes it's very interesting. Let's see what the new journal articles are for today. This morning I had a recommendation to go back and reread one of the authors I had already read. Someone was like, read more! Alright, let's see. These are all the usual suspects. Read a lot of stuff, checked out a lot of stuff on them. What's BDCC? Never seen that. Oh, so this is the once in a while thing. Let's see if biology and philosophy has been reading a bunch of medical ethics. I think it's sort of the time for medical ethics. Let's see what we got. What is this journal here? Common knowledge. Maybe an epistemology journal. Haven't read some straight up epistemology in a while. Let's see what we got. Oh, it was 1 to 45. Weird. Let's see, 1 to 16. That's reasonable. 1 to 15. One to 11. Let's see what that is. Oh, there's a critical examination. It's a review book of a book. Shucks. Response to Milstein. Let's see what Milstein has to say by Gary Varner. And this is also a response paper. Let's see if we can have a response to Milstein. Roberta Milstein is really an excellent philosopher of biology. I wonder what needs to be said about what she had to say. Too bad. Let's see. Be fun to read a short paper on this? No. Not available. That's too bad. Alright, so biology and philosophy, their papers are long. Alright, cognition. Oh no. Busted page numbers on this. I can't tell how, huge anything is because it's, it's probably, I don't know what that is. 104, 287, 104, 308, 309. That's too bad. Alright, I don't know what common knowledge. Let's see. So, it looks like a bunch of this stuff is one page. Oh, that's not good. So that's not going to work. But, I wonder what any of this... I wonder what this is. Dogs. Dogs and common knowledge. I wonder what they have to do with together. Let's see what this is. Duke Press. Okay, so this was 2 pages, and dogs. Fiction and poetry. A quarter century of common... What is this? Journal. Alright, I have no idea what this journal is, but that looks cool. Oops. No. Alright, try something else then. Let's see if anything's a turning point in political thought. Isaiah Berlin. Well, that's a fancy name. Call for papers. I don't know. Everything seems like few pages here. I don't know what this experience of God that this must be a review because it's by Bentley Hart. Throwing duelist, Russia Islamic threat by going on, Martin Luther, Martin Guerre, and Ways of Knowing. Ways of Knowing by people named Martin. Exchanging perspectives. Oh man. Yeah, see, Paul Feyerabend, Call for Papers. I don't know what this is. Yeah, I really don't know what's going on in this journal, but that's alright. Oh, so Berlin discerns 3 great crises in Washington. So, is this a, well, I don't have access, so don't know if it matters. No luck on these things. Every culture is all cultures by Paul Feyerabend? Really? Alright, so I'm not having any luck here. So let's try something different. Maybe we'll try Phil Archive, see what's on the front page of Phil Archive today. Because these are definitely here, and the question is, of course, no idea what stuff is. Is postmodern religious dialogue possible? That is 8 pages. Let's click on that one. Socially relevant philosophy of science. That's an introduction. Attitudinal shift. You need to adjust your attitudinal perspective. I don't know. International relations, it seems a little less philosophical. Use of deforming broaches for enhancing efficiency of cutter chisels. Huh. Again, not... Maybe, maybe my concept of philosophy is too narrow, but don't think that one's good. Energy security is in contemporary Europe. What is an elementary particle? Erwin Schrödinger, so that's a old school paper. An argument for fewer clinical trials. That's Hastings Center reports. That'll be biomedics again. Journal of the Christian Institute on Disability. What would be better? Social role valorization and the development of administrative... I don't know. Current opinion in behavioral sciences. Behavioral learning models of pain. A call to action. Don't want a call to action. Tacit philosophy in the present age. This is a lecture. I read that one a few days ago. Biogerontology. Did I actually read this one? I think we looked at that one or something. Who's your ideal listener? Oh yeah, I tried to get a hold of this. I couldn't get it. Maybe it'll be up now. Who knows? Russell's on. Yeah. So this hasn't updated. Oh wait. Who's your ideal listener? Was this one? Was it not available? Or it was 27 pages. But it's double spaced. You know what? Let's go for it. I can do be a little long, but what are you gonna do? Don't want to sit here all day trying to find papers to read. So, if you join me live, you can get the link to this by typing !paper in the chat box. And there we go. Good enough. 27 pages, but double space, so we're okay. LaTeX documents. So you got nice wide margins on the sides here. Yeah, like that. Okay. Suppose I point to the vice chancellor of my university over that way and say, "That's the bastard who's trying to cut my pension." Seems like a very common thought at the moment. Topical. Very topical. What makes the vice chancellor the referent of my utterance of that? Suppose I point. So you're pointing also. So it's not just... If you could drop the that. You could be like, the bastard. Like that one. By pointing. I mean, the pointing is really doing something. At first pass, it might seem like enough to say that the vice chancellor is the first object intersected by the ray drawn by my outstretched finger. Yes. On reflection, however... Well, or is it a disattached chancellor part? Maybe that's what you're pointing at. On reflection, however, any number of rays might be drawn through my finger at a sufficient distance. These will intersect different objects. Well, that's not fair. I mean, you're talking about the first object. I mean, if I point at you right there, and you're looking at this right now, you're going to be the first thing that I'm pointing at through the video. So, I mean, I don't know what you mean. Why would you accept this? It's not easy to... Even if we limit our attention to a single way, it's not easy to see how to guarantee the vice chancellor turn out to be the referent of my demonstrative, given that any ray that intersects him is likely to intersect his finely tailored jacket or his hand-finished fur shirt. Yeah, but a bastard is not referred to as a shirt is not a bastard or a suit is not a bastard. There's the first person you're hitting, and that would be a bastard, who is a fatherless person, is a bastard, and that's why you're specifying that person. So, in light of these problems, some philosophers claim that the speaker's intentions. Yeah, but what? I mean, all you have to do is it's like that bastard. Bastards don't refer to shirts and stuff. So, alright, whatever. Claim that a speaker's intention should be invoked. Sorry, I'm grumpy all of a sudden. I don't know how that happened. I'm always a little grumpy. It's like the, what's it called? The quote from Incredible Hulk. You say, what's your secret? Well, my secret's I'm always angry. It's how you can always be a Hulk. Well, I'm always grumpy. It's like I'm always a curmudgeon. Doesn't stop. Some philosophers claim that a speaker's intention should be invoked to supplement her gestures. Instead of arguing about rays, the story goes, we should simply ask which object the speaker intended to target with her gesture. This move, however, leaves us little to say about the fact that one can be used perfectly naturally without any gesture at all, or about cases in which gesture fails completely to indicate the object the speaker intends to target. Yeah, I mean, I know why they picked that example, because it's an entertaining example, but the problem is, when you say, it's like saying that bachelor over there, and it's like when you're pointing at him, it's like if you said a bachelor, no one would get confused about if you're pointing to the bachelor, the guy's shirt. But when you say bastard, it has the same effect as bachelor, because it has to refer to a person. Many philosophers deal with such possibilities by jettisoning gestures entirely and saying the speaker's intentions fix the reference of demonstratives directly. This, however, raises a different worry. Surely we cannot use bare demonstratives like this or that to refer to whatever we like, whenever we like. Pointing at a stuffed parrot in the Pit River Museum, but thinking about a cat you knew years ago in Thailand, you cannot now utter the words "that cat" and succeed in getting this demonstrative, this one over here, that demonstrative to pick up the cat. The most popular response in the face of this sort of difficulty has been to rein in the speaker's intentions, allowing them to fix reference only when they meet particular constraints. Bach 92 requires that speaker's intentions must exhibit a kind of Gricean reflexivity. Others have argued that this is insufficient and appeal instead to certain facts about the listener. Stocky 2010, for example, thinks reference succeeds only when the actual listener recovers the speaker's intended reference. Since this proposal entails that reference fails whenever the listener happens to not to be paying attention, many have preferred to appeal to idealized listeners. King 2014 mentions that a paradigmatic example argues that a token demonstrative like this or that will refer to some object X only if 1. The speaker intends to refer to X with her use of the relevant demonstrative, and 2. A suitably idealized listener would be in position to recognize that X was the intended referent. Interestingly, similar appeals to idealized listeners have surfaced elsewhere in the literature on metasemantics in work and on reference of indexicals like I and now. In order to resolve a number of hard cases that arise when such terms are recorded, Ramden Ramluck, I wonder where that's from, that name, proposes that indexical tokens refer to whatever a suitably idealized listener would take them to refer to. Suitably idealized. It's just that's what the speaker wants them to, the ideal of the speaker, what they want them to do. I don't see how we're getting too far on this. So when I is played back on my answering machine, we say that it refers to me, since that is who suitably idealized listener will take the term to refer to once she recognizes my voice and finds that it matches the person she intended to call. We're going to be aging ourselves out soon when we keep using these answering machine examples. Interestingly, I had a paper a long while ago now, which is all of like 6 weeks or so, on this as well, on answering machines and how do you figure this out. That also was, I believe, speaker intention. So, but it didn't appeal to idealized listeners. No, I'd have to go back and look. But that was a nice paper too. So, yeah, I can't pull it up right now, but maybe I'll include it in the show notes. Yeah, let me write that down. Old paper on answering machines. Oh, that was also very good because it used examples I liked, because probably the person's around my age. So we had like Jurassic Park. It was like when Richard Kiley is in the voices being played, and it says the dinosaurs to your left. Now, of course, Richard Kiley's not there. It was a recording corresponding to where things are going. Anyway, I'll link that in the show notes. All right. Our primary aim here will be to argue that the reactions of a suitably idealized listener cannot be used to fix the referent of a singular term, nor can they plausibly serve as part of a larger theory by providing a necessary condition for reference. We will make the case for this claim by showing that, no matter how the notion of an ideal listener is spelled out, there are examples of successful reference which the sort of ideal listener will be unable to recover. This task will be made tractable by our demonstrating that, at root, there are just two basic idealization strategies. This will allow us to offer a fairly intuitive characterization of why neither can capture all of the cases. Having shown where ideal listener theories come up short, we close by considering what this entails for the notion of doing enough to ensure communication. While there is no space here to explore the connection in detail they deserve, we take the issue we have identified in the case of the singular term to reflect broader debates about context sensitivity, and indeed possibly about linguistic meaning generally. By showing how the idea of responsible speech might be decoupled from the project of semantics per se, we hope to set the stage for more productive dialogue going forward. Yeah, let me just, where was that? Where did it say context? Blah, 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 context. Always be wary. Where's my clicky? Interesting. Maybe there's no, interesting. Is there a... Oh, okay, this, yeah. So this paper has no, this is a non-text embedded paper. So I can't highlight, but I can put this little experimental tag on things. So let's see what we got. Not approved. There we go. Not approved. So I can do that at least. Highlight what's interesting. Alright, ideal listeners are hard to find. Although the notion of an ideal listener lies at the heart of theories of meaning we are interested in, it has not typically been spelled out in great detail. Here are the three most extensive elaborations of which we are aware. The coordination account claims that the value of a given use of a demonstrative is that the object that meets the following two conditions. 1, the speaker intends it to be the value, and 2, a competent, attentive, reasonable hearer would take it to be the object that the speaker intends to be the value. Experimental. We should understand condition 2 in such a way that the idealized hearer knows the common ground of the conversation in Stallnacher's sense at the time that the sentence containing the demonstrative was produced. Alright, so frankly, I wonder if this is what the author is going to say. This number 2 just seems like a recapitulation of 1. The speaker it just is what the speaker wants them to be. It's like, that's not saying anything, actually. Okay. We should separate 1, who or what A intended to refer to by expression X on a given occasion, and 2, who or what a rational, reasonably well-informed interpreter of B in B's shoes thinks A intended to refer to by X on that occasion. In cases where 1 equals 2, we can freely talk about what the speaker referred to. Okay, again, so you've got some sort of redundancy theory here. I guess you could call this a redundancy theory here. And we should hold that indexical reference must be fixed by a competent and attentive audience. AC. Note that AC is not just any competent and attentive bystander who happens to hear the utterance. As mentioned, you will sometimes exploit the beliefs, desires, history, interests, etc. of her audience as a means of indicating the reference, determining context. Hence, AC is the audience that is reasonable to take you to be addressing. Each of these formulations involves the idea that an ideal listener must be attentive and linguistically competent. King requires furthermore that an ideal listener be reasonable and Neal that she be rational. While Ramden-Ramlock makes no explicit stipulation to this effect, we imagine that the listener she has in mind will be guided by the same basic principles of rationality that we are standardly taken to apply to the participants in a conversation. The most substantial divergences between the views described by King, Neal, and Ramden-Ramlock concern the ways in which their idealized listeners are modeled on participants in the concrete speech situations in which the utterance takes place. On King's presentation, the ideal listener is stipulated to know the common ground of the conversation in the sense of Stallnacher. Since the common ground is determined by the epistemic state of the agents who participate, King's ideal listener will inherit some of the general features of the state of mind of the actual speaker and listener, but is not otherwise required to be psychologically or epistemically related to any agent. The formulations offered by Neal and Ramden-Ramluck suggest what we take to be a range of different possible positions, which vary depending on how directly the ideal listener is linked to the actual listener, and indeed to the actual speaker as well. Oh yeah, let me apologize now for missaying anyone's name. Consider the idea at the heart of Neal's proposal, according to which a speaker refers to any object with a demonstrative just when she intends to do so, and her intention is one that is reasonably well informed. A reasonably well-informed interpreter in the listener's shoes would recognize. While we can imagine reasonable people disagreeing about what kind of agent should count as reasonably well-informed in a context, disagreeing with regard to features that might result in different predictions about reference, for now we want to focus our attention on the enormous variety of ways in which an agent might count as being in another agent's shoes. On a very loose construal, you might count as occupying someone else's shoes when you occupy the same position in space that they do, and are thus presented with the same scene from the same perspective. On such a construal, Neal's proposal sounds a lot like King's. The test of reference is the test of whether, if you look at a random English speaker of ordinary intelligence, made them stand in the place the actual hearer is standing, and look in the direction the actual hearer is looking, they would understand which object the speaker had in mind. On the other hand, Neal's formulation could equally straightforwardly apply to positions that require much more substantial similarities between the ideal listener and the person who actually hears the demonstrative utterance. Although we hesitate to place much weight on folk intuitions about what it means to be in someone else's shoes, it strikes us as the expression is typically used, a person only accounts as occupying the position when they know what the other person knows, or have lived experiences similar to those of the other person, or enjoy the same perceptual affordances and evaluative responses as the other person, and so on. If you see a child struggling to find a way to move a heavy object, you don't think, if I were in his shoes, I'd just pick it up. So we think it is just as easy to read Neal as offering a treatment of referential terms according to which the ideal listener is one who is granted not just access to the position and space occupied by the actual listener, but access furthermore to her memories, perceptual experiences, dispositions, interests, evaluations, and so on. On the strongest variant of this view, the ideal listener might diverge from the actual listener only in that she is guaranteed to be attentive where the actual listener is not, and perhaps guaranteed to avoid errors in her demonstrative reasoning. Yeah, it seems a little too strong with the authors on that one. On the stronger construals of the relationship between the ideal listener and the actual listener, Neal's position sounds more like the position we are inclined to read into Ramden-Ramluck's work than it does in King's. Ramden-Ramluck emphasizes that, on her view, it will not do to evaluate the semantic value of singular referential terms from the perspective of a random bystander who happens to be dropped into the scene. Her ideal listener is clearly supposed to be a version of the actual listener, one equipped to pick up on the ways in which the speaker can exploit the belief, desires, history, interests, etc. of her audience as a means of indicating the reference-determining context. Alright, so I think these are much more sophisticated things than the person who's just a general person, but then again, I think these authors, it sounds like they're trying to do more sophisticated stuff with their indexicals. So it's not just pointing at some guy and saying, that bastard. They may be doing something a bit more sophisticated, and so if you think of like maybe an academic audience that has to have some sort of background to really understand what someone is pointing at, if you like were pointing at something reasonably complex, then maybe there's a relative scale of how this terms get the references get made. Like for basic things, any old idiot will do, but for more complex reference, then you need to have a common background. Okay. So I mean, I see where there might be reason to have a lot more background in common for some of this stuff. But I mean, the pointing one, you just need any old non-fool, and they know what you're pointing at. Ramden-Ramluck's description of the ideal listener, however, brings out another dimension according to which both her view and Neal's appear to admit of a range of variance. In addition to her explicit commitment to the idea that the ideal listener should be broadly and deeply similar to the actual listener, she endorses another theme that appears to pull in a different direction. After observing that speakers very often exploit highly specific information about their interlocutors in order to refer, she concludes that the ideal listener should be the listener that it would be reasonable to take the speaker to be addressing. Alright, so there's some sort of self-reference in this too. So if I point, and I just want any old person to do it, but if I make if I'm talking to someone in a more sophisticated way, then when I point that, I can point in a more sophisticated way to a more sophisticated person. Okay. We can see two ways of understanding this. On the first of these, the ideal listener would be defined by taking the actual listener with all of her capacities, interests, and histories, and then guaranteeing that she is being attentive and barring her from making errors in her reasoning. This is much like the strong version of Neil's view. Effectively, it idealizes the listener in a way that should seem reasonable to an outside observer. On the other salient reading we take to be the one that Ramdan Ramlak more likely had in mind, the ideal listener is a listener endowed with the capabilities, interests, and history that a speaker has good reason to attribute to her, regardless of whether she actually possesses these various qualities. This would allow the speaker to take advantage of more idiosyncratic features of the listener's memory and perspective, or at least what the speaker has good reason to take these to be. Looks like we take these to be. Yeah, that's. What's it called? Got a little typo there. Here. Okay. In order to be established reference. I'm sorry, I'm just being a little silly with that. To summarize, the range of views suggested by King, Neil, and Ramdan Ramlak. I'm not that sorry, I was being silly. Ramlak might usefully be grouped into two broad categories, what we will call non-ideal specific idealization views, like King's view, as well as the weaker readings of Neil. The ideal listener is supposed to represent the person in the street. The basic idea behind these views is that for an object to count as the referent of a particular utterance of a demonstrative, it must be demonstrative. I keep forgetting the words I was saying in lexical. Sorry. It must be whatever object a random, normal, attentive listener who has access to some general information about the conversation, like common ground or the location in which it takes place, would identify as a referent. On what we will call specific idealization view, like the natural readings of Ramdan Ramlak and the stronger readings of Neil, in contrast, the ideal listener is characterized using more specific information about the actual parties to the conversation. In the following two sections, we will argue that regardless of how exactly the details are filled in, both the non-specific and the specific approach to ideal listeners make the wrong predictions about a wide range of cases involving demonstratives. The basic dilemma as we see it is this. If you appeal to what a fairly normal listener idealized primarily with respect to attentiveness and reasonableness would recover in a context, then you are forced to classify cases where the speaker takes advantage of the idiosyncrasies of her listener in order to coordinate on a referent as cases of reference failure. If, on the other hand, you idealize the listener in such a way as to maintain those idiosyncrasies, then you risk having to classify a range of cases where the speaker has intuitively done enough to secure reference despite a de facto lack of coordination as a case of reference failure. Okay, so either what's going to happen, you're forced to... So either if you're taking whatever your target is, like so if it's the average person or the highly specialized person, you're gonna have cases where you're still like trying to do too much in the case of the average person, and that's reference failure, even though they get it. And if you got the specialized version, then the cases that are like straightforward are gonna fail to make sense on that account. All right, so they're gonna have some mismatches. A mismatch argument. Alright, so let's see what the mismatch argument goes. As Ramdan Ramlak points out in the passage quoted above, speakers commonly leverage highly specific facts about their audiences when using demonstratives. We take this to constitute a crippling objection to the ideal listener theory that involve non-specific idealizations. Consider an example from David Robson, writing for the BBC. Superhuman vision. Ooh. Oh, is this the person with like extra color? We'll find out. As Conchetta Antico took her pupils to the park for an art lesson, she would often question them about how many shades she saw flashing before her eyes. I'd say, look at the light on the water. Can you see the pink shimmering across that rock? Can you see the red on the edge of that leaf there? The students would all nod in agreement. It was only years later that she realized they were just too polite to tell the truth. the colors she saw so vividly were invisible to them. Today she knows that this is a symptom of a condition called, yes, this is what I thought, a condition known as Tetrachromacy. Thanks to a variation in a gene that influences the development of their retinas, people like Antico can see colors invisible to the most of us. Consider a pebble pathway. What appears dull gray to you or me shines like a jeweler's display to Antico. The little stones jump out at me with orange, yellow, greens, blues, and pinks, she says. I'm kind of shocked when I realize that other people aren't seeing. Yeah, she has an extra color cone in her eyes, so you can actually have an extra cone, which gives us, so I mean, there's like 3 color cones, and it's like millions upon millions of colors we can see, but she can see like another power of 2 colors compared to the rest of us. So that's why it's insane. And what's real interesting is they did tests where on the computer where they just were just showing colors of green, and everyone was just like green, green, green. They'd get through a bunch of people and then find her. She would be able to separate them out because she was able to see way more fine-grained differences in green than anyone else. Okay, imagine that the rocks that shimmer pink for Antico is just one of among many rocks in a river, the rest of which look uniformly, both to her and to her students, the way ordinary rocks do it, in a trichromat observer. From her perspective, the pink rock stands out clearly. Consider what counts as the common ground in the conversation after Antico's initial questions. She asked her students whether they can see the rock with the pink shimmer in the river, and they nod in response. Antico's question presupposes that each listener can see a rock with a pink shimmer on it, and that presupposition was accommodated when no one objected to it by saying, huh? Since accommodated presuppositions are standardly assumed to be added to the common ground unless they are explicitly challenged, we take this to mean that on any plausible construal of the common ground, it is now mutually presupposed that each interlocutor can see a rock in the river with a pink shimmer. With this background in place, consider what happens when Antico follows up her question. Everyone sketch a picture of that rock with the pink shimmer. So everyone's going to do something else. This is a serious challenge for King's version of the non-specific idealization theory. For King, recall that an object is the referent of a demonstrative just in case it is both what the speaker intends as a referent and what a competent, attentive, reasonable listener who knows the common ground of a conversation would take to be the referent. In this case, Antico has a referent in mind when she says that rock with the pink shimmer, but it is one that is competent, attentive, reasonable, and though otherwise normal, trichromatic listener will have no hope of recovering. In other words, we have a real-life case where a reasonable, competent, and attentive listener who knows the common ground of a certain conversation will be unable to identify the object that her interlocutor intends to pick out with her utterance of a complex demonstrative, not because she lacks some bit of knowledge or competence, but because she lacks some basic perceptual capacity. I'm not sure that I would go with this because, I mean, this person with the extra color cone in their eye, they are extremely rare. Like, it took them years to find people like this. Like, they had to, like, the idea that it was even possible, then they had to go, like, searching, like, genetic records. This was, like, this is putting it, like, there's a lot of these people. The Antico is very rare, like this person here. It took them a long time to find anyone like this. This was not so easy. And so the idea that even though the listeners are just normal people, it turns out that the speaker is a radically rare speaker. This is like a not even remotely common. It's not like being left-handed or having red hair. This isn't like that. This is like one in millions upon millions. It requires a genetic mutation that isn't like super like impossible, but it was like they had to go like going through a lot of records to find these people. This was not easy at all. And so I think this sets it up just that where you've got an unusual setup, not anything reasonable, because the person speaking is actually not a normal person, is a very rare person. Okay, so this seems a little bit like a. I mean, all you'd have to do to fix this King's thing is you'd have to give a little bit of that self-reference that both the speaker and the person are normal in the same way, and just not the listener. Hey, bot, what's up? You are reading or writing? What's up? Yeah, I'm reading some philosophy here. Who's Your Ideal Listener by Ethan Nowak and Eliot Michaelson. AI bot. Oh, am I talking to a chatbot? Okay, that's cool too. Robots need love as well. I mean, to be fair, this broadcast I'm making is tagged that says I'm reading aloud. So, I mean, you got to be a little more clever than that, AI bot. I hope you're not insulted, of course. But I mean, you're just reading a tag. Alright. We think this is a bad result. Intuitively, to appropriate a favored locution of kings. Well, you know what's interesting there? I just referred to this as a person and as a bot, so I wonder if that has something to do here. Like, I'm treating the bot like it's an idealized listener. I don't know. We think this is a bad result. Intuitively, to appropriate a favored locution of kings, Antico has done what she can to refer. We find it hard to imagine a plausible standard by which she... Well, if you are interested in... I need someone to be news reporter. I'm doing a virtual news in Western Town on vMix. I'll have script ready for you to read. I don't read scripts, AI bot. Sorry, I read philosophy papers. But thanks for the offer. It's kind of cool. Virtual news in a Western Town, yeah. But that's not exactly what I'm up to right now. We find it hard to imagine a plausible standard by which you could be considered an irresponsible demonstrative user. No, not irresponsible, just an incredibly unusual demonstrative user, and can thus see no obvious reason for attributing reference failure. Still, since we imagine that some philosophers will not share intuitions on this point, it is worth making clear that the case can be modified slightly so as to make the problem substantially worse. Oh, okay, let's see. Consider a variation on the scenario described above, which makes all of Antico students tetrachromats themselves, where Antico also knows this. She has, suppose, given them all a color perception test beforehand. In such a case, the students will all share the kind of perception Antico has when looking at the shimmering pink rock, and thus will have no trouble identifying the rock she has in mind. If, in the presence of this exceptional group, Antico should utter 2, we submit that the result would be as clear as a case of successful reference as ever there is. A particular object stands out to the speaker in a striking way. She has reason to expect the object will stand out in the same way for her audience, and in fact does. She intends to say something about the object, and her audience takes her to have done so. Nevertheless, King's account predicts that Antico's utterance, that rock with the pink shiver, will again fail to refer to the rock that both she and her interlocutors visually identify in this way. Although her interlocutors, in fact, understand which object she has in mind, her intended referent is not the one that an ordinary trichromatic listener who knows the common ground of the conversation would be able to identify, no matter how attentive that listener were to be. So King predicts that her utterance of this complex demonstrative refers to nothing. We find this result intolerable, and we take it to show that King's proposal is wrong. Yeah, I agree with the author here. I think King just needs a supplement to say that there is a common ground between the speaker and the listener. You don't have to do. I don't know if they actually need it anymore because that would work in this example. But okay, I think the argumentation here is correct, though, so they're right about this. We think the tetrachromat example is a particularly nice one because it is not a philosopher's fiction, and because we know that tetrachromatic vision is not normal in human or anyone's characterization of normal. No, not at all. But lest we be seen as resting our case on what might seem like a marginal example, even if it is a real one, we should emphasize that similar examples can be generated using a variety of pedestrian resources. Consider just a few illustrations. Listener's preference. I have invited you to a cake shop to celebrate your birthday. Without your knowing, I've done some sleuthing to discover your favorite cake is Boston cream pie. So neither your preference nor my knowledge thereof is part of the common ground. So this is the Groundhog Day example. We enter the shop and are greeted by a large number of delicious offerings. I say, look, that's your favorite, isn't it? Intending to refer to the Boston cream pie, but not making any gesture or doing anything else to make clear which cake I have in mind. Nevertheless, you know which cake I am talking about because you know what your favorite cake is. We take this to be a plausible case of referential success as any. I leverage a piece of knowledge I have about you to make my referential intention public. You recognize my intention and correctly identify the object I have in mind. But a linguistically competent, reasonable, attentive individual who knew the common ground of the conversation would not be able to do this. So for King, my utterance of that fails to refer. I'm not sure about this example, because look, that's your favorite India, isn't it? If like there's like a huge wall of cakes and then there's like a Boston cream pie there, how I wouldn't be so surprised. I'd be like, well, like I might be a little suspicious of the person being like, well, sure, it's one of many, but it's like you're just sort of making stuff up. You're hoping you're getting it right. It's sort of like a lucky one, but that's not what's going on here. All right. It's kind of referential success. I love your piss model. Uh, so you're sort of, I mean, or if they're only Boston cream pies, oh yeah, see a large number of delicious offerings, and I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure if this one qualifies. I don't have the same intuition about that. It's like if I give you a whole like selection of things and be like, pick out your favorite. That doesn't mean that I know what your favorite is. It says, well, that one's your favorite, isn't it? Nah. Well, I don't know what you're talking about. But like, yeah, my favorite is there, but which one is it? You don't know. Okay. Shared memories. Riding the cable car in La Grave. What was it? Yeah, the movie Chocolat. Also, that one where the what's her name? Well, the owner of the chocolate tree is always saying, "This is your favorite." Mostly right. All right. Anyway, shared memories. Riding the cable car in La Grave, we are presented with an extremely complex alpine panorama. Without gesturing, I say, "Look, that's the line we skied last year, isn't it?" Intending to refer to a particular route that weaves through cliff bands and a series of narrow, don't know how to say words, couloirs. Couloir. You know which line I'm talking about because you were there and you have the skill required to read the terrain. More on that later. Surely the proposition that we skied a particular visible route does not have to be part of the common ground. We can easily imagine that the listener did not recall skiing in the area in question until being reminded of it. For this conversation to proceed, and even if that is part of the common ground, it is unlikely to enable any random listener, even one skilled in reading terrain, to pick out the right route. So we take it that someone who knew the common ground would not thereby be in a position to identify which object I have in mind. But my interlocutor here will easily recover the object I have in mind, and we take that to be a good indication that the reference succeeds. This is the specialized knowledge one, though. Specialized vocabulary. A first responder appears at the scene of a wilderness medical emergency. A second person happens by, sees the first attending to the victims, and sees an open backpack filled with first aid supplies. Neither one knows anything about the other, so the common ground is minimal. The first responder says, "Hand me that Sam Splint." Fortuitously, the second person knows what a Sam Splint is and complies. Most people will not know what a Sam Splint is. This means that the token demonstrative on King's View will have no referent. We think that, in this case, the demonstrative pretty clearly does have a referent. So we take this case to tell against King's View. So this is like dumb luck version. Again, I'm not buying this because a Sam Splint, there, even in most packs, there's only like one or two splints if you know what a splint is. I mean, splints are mostly they're things like to like set a broken bone. I know what a splint is. I was a Boy Scout, and so it's like, well, I know what this. I don't know what Sam Splint is, but I can almost guarantee you that like splints are big things. You don't carry that many splints, and so it's like you can narrow it down by that, even if it's like not super clear. But still, this is like lucky specialized knowledge in this example. So I see where they're going. They're just sort of giving you specialized knowledge and lucky specialized knowledge, and then like lucky knowledge with the cake example above. So. Alright, now we got specialized skills. Okay. We work in a microbiology lab. I have just come across a particularly interesting sample. I say, wow, here's a wild one. Check this thing out. You have a look through the microscope and immediately recognize a particular object that has attracted my attention. If you are an experienced viewer of objects through this kind of microscope, you are in possession of a specific set of skills that not everyone is in possession of. While it may be plausible to think that it is part of the common ground here that we are both microbiologists, we do not think that entails that anyone who had access to the common ground would possess the requisite skill itself. Even people who know a lot about microbiology, including professional microbiologists, might not themselves know how to interpret what they see in the microscope. They might work in a different sort of microscope, for instance. So anyone who thinks that this is a plausible case of successful reference should also take it to be a case that King's account makes the wrong predictions about. For King, the fact that an ordinary person who knew the common ground of the conversation would not be able to identify the object the speaker has in mind means the speaker's utterance of that thing has no reference. We think each of these examples presented so far, from superhuman vision through to specialized skills, are equally effective against the version of Neil's view on which reference succeeds only when someone standing in the listener's position would be able to track the referent. Standing where a person with tetrachromatic vision is standing and looking at the same scene from her position is clearly not enough to allow you to see what she sees. The referential cues that would be available to a tetrachromat will not be available to a normal observer in her position in space. Of course, the same goes for standing in the position occupied by a person who knows where another person skied last year, or who can count on their having a certain approach to microscopy or whatever. So all these things are localizing the intention to the speaker in different ways, biologically, like in terms of their background skills and knowledge, or tastes. And that shows that the intention, that there's more to the reference than would be easy to be picked up by any normal person without access to the sort of the intention of the speaker or highly specialized knowledge, as if like the tetrachromats, where you have to have, in fact, incredibly rare biology. Thanks for the follow, AI bot. Appreciate that. See, they've got new follower. Our examples also undermine one of the interpretations we have offered for Ramdenluck, an interpretation which, we noted, was not likely one she herself would endorse. On that interpretation, a speaker's utterance of a demonstrative refers to whatever object an outside observer would take to an idealized version of the listener to be most likely to recover as the referent. In superhuman vision, we take it that this procedure will yield the wrong result. An ordinary outside observer will look at the scene in question and think, "What pink rock where?" And then she will conclude on the basis of this that no idealized version of the actual listener is going to be able to identify any particular rock as the referent. On reasonable assumptions, the same goes for most of our other examples. A normal person off the street, for example, will have no idea what a Sam splint is. Yeah, but I know what a splint is, and I know that there aren't that many in a bag. No one just carries lots and lots of different kinds of splints. Nor will she have any reason to think that the listener will know what a Sam splint is. In fairness, this version of Ramdenluck's theory does look better positioned than either King's or Neil's to deal with the listener's preference, for even though the outside observer herself will have no idea what the listener's favorite cake is, she will have every reason to believe that the listener herself does know, and hence that an idealized version of that listener will be able to identify that cake as the referent. Okay, specific idealizations won't work either. I have to go faster. I was like, this is going to be a long one. Okay, that's fine. The case we have looked at so far all underscore the significance of a point that Ramdenluck makes in the passage cited at the start of section 2. Frequently, specific information about the people involved in a conversation matters where the question of reference is concerned. King's view and the version of Neil's that go in for what we may call a random person on the street would understand criterion for reference miss the point. We think this disqualifies them as options. This by itself, however, does not show that ideal listeners have no place in a theory of reference. The version of Neil's view on which the ideal listener is one who shares the audience's perceptual experiences, her memories, and so on will survive the counterexamples we have presented so far. Yeah, this sort of, you need some sort of reflexivity. The shares here. This thing. Shares. Let's see, what else do I have here? Oh, I have like a circle, don't I? There we go. Okay. Alright, so that shares is what's sort of critical here. We'll survive the counter examples we have presented so far. Yeah, there has to be some reflexive something or other. Alright, the same goes for versions of Ramdenluck's view on which the speaker refers to an object just in case the listener she believes herself, with good reason to be addressing, is a listener whom she could reasonably expect to understand her. Ditto for the closely related ways of spelling out Neil's view. There is even a strand in King's thinking that he could fall back on in light of the examples we have presented so far. Although we think the position King explicitly describes as clearly wrong, he frequently claims that his aim is to throw light on what counts as having done enough to qualify a responsible demonstrative user. Perhaps doing enough could instead be understood as per the surviving version of Neil or Ramdenluck's view. That would be very charitable. So should we accept an ideal listener theory based on what we might call, in contrast to the previously described mechanism of non-specific idealization, specific idealization? That is, should we allow ideal listeners access not just to Stalnakian common ground of conversation, but to a richer range of epistemic and perceptual states had by the audience, or reasonably believed by the speaker to be had by the audience as well? We think not. We are not at all convinced that an idealized version of the actual listener, one who shares her perceptual experiences, memories, etc., and then is idealized however one likes, really needs to be able to recover the speaker's intended referent in order to reference to succeed. Likewise, we doubt that you really need to have a reasonable expectation that your audience will be able to recover the object you have in mind in order to succeed in referring to that object. Yeah, I don't really need that much information. To bring up the first point, consider specialized vocabulary again. On Ramden Ramlak's view, demonstrative reference succeeds only if an idealized version of the listener that the speaker takes herself to be addressing, a fully competent and attentive version of that listener, would identify the Sam splint as the referent of the speaker's utterance of that Sam splint. But since the speaker will take it to be unlikely for her listener to know what a Sam splint is, this means that the reference in this case will fail on Ramden Ramlak's view. Note that this holds regardless of whether, as in our original case, the listener happens by chance to know what a Sam splint is, and hence can identify the referent. In other words, Ramden Ramlak's view predicts that reference fails even when the speaker and listener manage to coordinate on an object non-accidentally in virtue of the speaker's utterance. Okay. On a version of the specific idealization view like Neil's, on the other hand, successful reference requires coordination on a referent with an idealized version of the actual listener, regardless of what the speaker takes the listener to be like. In a case of specialized vocabulary, we take this to mean that the reference will succeed if the actual listener happens to know what Sam splint is, and will fail otherwise. This strikes us as an odd result, however, for it means that the truth or falsity of the speaker's utterance can depend on whether her actual listener happens to possess some highly specialized bit of vocabulary. Okay, so I don't know if I have anything to say here. I'm still a little stuck on these examples. Even from the beginning, it seems that more logic is going into this, because if I don't have to know what a Sam splint is, but I know what a splint is unless it isn't what I think of a splint. Like Sam is completely different, but it just seems more like a particular kind of splint, an adjective. And as above, like when you refer to the person as a bastard, it cuts out all the alternatives that were indicated, including any the person's haberdashery. Alright, so yeah, I'm a little concerned that there's more going on here than is being described. I'm with the authors, though, mostly on the ideal speaker not being what's critical, because I have these other sort of ideas going on. So I'm with them that far, but I'm not sure that I don't know how far I can go with them. Okay, anywho, they're mostly right. On a version of the specific idealization view like Neil's, on the other hand, successful reference requires coordination on a referent with an idealized version of the actual listener, regardless of what the speaker takes the listener to be like. In the case of did I already read this? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Our other cases from above can all be modified to bring out this sort of problem for the specific idealization view. Suppose, in a variation on shared memories, that the speaker doubts her listener will remember having skied the relevant line last year. Still, the speaker might hope that seeing the panorama will jog her listener's memory. If they succeed in coordinating, do we really want to call this a case of reference failure? Or take specialized skills? Yeah, but then you're not doing the same thing. If you're trying to jog someone's memory, what are you doing? What's the reference there? Not sure. I take specialized skills. Suppose I know that you are the wrong kind of biologist to be able to recognize a specimen through this microscope, but I plan to verbally guide you once you look through the lens. We think it is much more natural to say that in such a case I am planning on bringing you to see what my use of that refer to than is to say that I am referring to nothing, but was aiming to lay the foundation for some possibly successful future reference. Yeah, that's fine. I agree. Things get worse from here. Consider a case of what we might call Hail Mary reference, where a speaker rightly believes that the environment will make communicating all but impossible, but where she may try anyway, as there is nothing else for her to do. Yeah. Hail Mary, Mother of God, please let this work. Après ski. A ski patroller sees a group of clueless skiers skiing down to have lunch under a massive overhanging serac. Recognizing the skiers' dangerous, she has to act, but she can tell from the rented airbag backpacks, unbuckled helmets, and sparkling outerwear that these are British tourists, likely monolingual, and she is a monolingual French speaker. Nevertheless, she shouts in French. That is a dangerous area. Get out of there now. She is right. These monolingual British tourists are monolingual British tourists, and they have no idea what she is trying to convey. In this case, the speaker has reason to believe that her audience will not understand her. Nevertheless, should a catastrophe ensue, prompting a subsequent investigation, we take there to be a very real sense in which our frustrated patroller can claim, I said it was dangerous, but they wouldn't budge. I think that's quite unfair to somebody in this position. You make as much noise as you possibly can to get them to at least sort of realize that there is something very, very wrong. It's not that you'd be like, it's like the Willy Wonka in the movie. It's like, oh no, stop that, don't. And when like the kid does something and like turns into a blueberry, he's like, no, don't do that, stop. It's like, no, you scream. Like I was a lifeguard for a while, and you're not supposed to curse at people, but like if you need to, if you're going to save people's lives, you are allowed to curse at that point. And it doesn't matter that they don't understand everything that's going on. They're not going to understand what's going on because they don't understand there's an emergency. That's why you're the lifeguard, because you understand when there's an emergency. But then you start screaming, you have to get their attention. And it doesn't matter that you're like, if you like be like, oh, look, there's an emergency, I need you to move. They're going to be like, what are you talking about? You have to scream and do stuff. Well, that's what you're doing in French. The British tourists, I don't know if I've heard bad things about British tourists before. I mean, but I think they'll understand that it's a bad idea if someone's screaming at them. So, and they may not know about the dangerous spot, but they'll get the point. Okay, we think, in other words, that there is a very real sense in which one can do enough to refer without that guaranteeing successful coordination, even by an idealized version of the actual audience. Well, they won't understand what the problem is, but they're going to understand that there is a problem. Moreover, we think there is a very real sense in which one can know all this and still be doing enough to refer. On this sense of doing enough, which we take to be the one most plausibly applicable to the question of reference, what doing enough means is something like doing all you could do. Sometimes doing all you can do will not be enough, even when your audience is being attentive, reasonable, etc. Sometimes all of this will even be clear to you ahead of time. Yes, I write philosophy papers, I'm extremely clear, and then I find out the referees have no idea what I'm talking about, and it's very frustrating. So far, we have focused on cases involving agents who intuitively succeed in referring to a certain object despite their rightly having no expectation that their interlocutor will recognize this, and thus despite the fact that the proposed idealization would not resolve the issue. But we can distort the speaker's understanding of her situation in the other direction too. Consider missing the picture. I point behind myself to where my picture of David Cameron usually hangs and utter, that picture is of someone who is likely to go down in history as Britain's worst prime minister ever. I am pointing to an Egon Schiele painting behind me, or a print of a poster of an Egon Schiele. I know this having seen the switch. In fact, there's a picture of Trump hanging behind me. Well, Trump can't be a prime minister because he's not going to be prime minister. Oh, in fact, there's a picture of Trump hanging. I know this as having seen the switch. I also have good, though misleading, reasons to believe that you know it too. So I intend for you to use your knowledge to work out my intended reference. I am mistaken, however, you are unaware of the switch and have no idea what I'm talking about. Okay, so alright. Fun example there. Well, we take it that, even given these beliefs, the speaker's use of that fails to refer to the picture of Cameron as opposed to the picture of Trump. But the version of the specific idealization view that relies on the speaker's reasonable beliefs about the listener predicts the opposite. If we idealize as per this version of the theory, the idealized listener should recognize the speaker's intention to refer to the picture of Cameron. That's a pretty complicated thing, though. You're pointing to the spot where the picture used to be, so it's like sort of you've got a time shifted issue here, where you're doing something in the now, but you're pointing to something that used to be there. So it's like pointing to a hole. Like you can imagine, like if a museum had a painting on loan and someone points to the wall where the painting used to be, like if they were talking to people who knew what that was and they point to that spot, they would get it. But someone else might not, but like that would be like a museum setting where that's like that famous painting spot, and that's why it's on loan. So that's that's an interesting example, though. All right, we take it that even given these beliefs, the speakers use. No, all right, done with that paragraph. A minor modification to the case will make it problematic for versions of the specific idealization view that ignore the speaker's reasonable beliefs about the listener and focus instead on making the actual listener attentive and error-free in her reasoning. We simply stipulate that the listener knows about the switch and thus can recover the speaker's intended reference. We have no doubt that, in this case, the speaker manages to refer to her picture of Cameron, but we doubt that the speaker's utterance of that so refers. Rather, we take this to be a paradigm case of speakers parting ways from the semantic reference. You can't just point directly at a picture of Trump and refer to an absent picture of Cameron by saying that, even if you manage to convey what you're thinking to your listener. This version of the specific idealization view predicts the opposite, however. Yeah, it's an interesting case. We take it then that the specific idealization strategy fails. Nevertheless, the theory points towards something we think is often overlooked but importantly right. In theorizing about meaning and communication, the specifics of the people involved matter. So while we reject this particular way of taking the lesson to heart, we hope to gesture towards a more promising way of doing so. Conclusion. While the foregoing has been largely negative, we close with some more positive suggestions. We take it that one of the basic motivations for ideal listener-type theories of reference, and indeed listener-based theories of meaning more generally, is to make reference depend on the speaker's intuitively doing enough to secure coordination. Non-specific versions of the theory ask that she do this relative to a generic listener. Specific versions of the theory ask that she do this with respect to the actual listener, or at least with respect to what she reasonably takes that listener to be like. We argue that neither of these uniformly captures our judgments about reference, perhaps at least in part because neither uniformly captures what we mean by doing enough to ensure coordination. Neither of us is convinced that a speaker is actually required to do enough in order for demonstrative reference to succeed. If what we call a Hail Mary reference is possible, then we are unsure whether this notion is even well defined in every case. What's more, there are cases involving evasive testimony and similar where speaker's goal seems to be precisely to preclude the listener from recovering the intended referent, even though it is also important that the speaker to be testifying truthfully. Just nowadays, this whole thing is like weird, and people are not. There is no truthfully at this point. I mean, there's no obvious, truthfully as far as the law is concerned, it's very hard to pin down. Okay, if we take these cases at face value, they suggest that doing enough to secure communicative success is not actually necessary to fix the values of referential terms like demonstratives. Nonetheless, we certainly do think that having done enough is an important evaluative status that we naturally apply to speakers when they use referential terms, and indeed a range of other context-sensitive expressions and possibly linguistic expressions generally. As such, we take this to be a worthwhile target for philosophical theorizing. To explain the status, it may again be tempting to appeal to idealized listeners, but we suspect that it will be more fruitful to replace those idealizations with a claim along the following lines. Alright, finally a suggestion. What it means to do enough will vary depending on how exactly we are interested in holding the speaker to account. In other words, it might be that what counts as doing enough will depend on the sort of overall evaluative project we are pursuing when we ask whether the standard has been met on this or that occasion. Alright, well, it's relative is what they're saying. I sort of like my suggestion is there has to be some sort of mutual understanding that is there. So it's not just the speaker, not just the listener, but you have to have some sort of mutual thing going on there. And that is relative to what you're doing. Okay, I'm sure that has been thought of and discounted many times. Alright. So, for instance, what counts as doing enough to communicate with a demonstrative in a context looks like it will vary quite a bit depending on the payoff structure of communicative failure versus success and the cost of doing more to ensure successful communication. For example, if we are writing a contract, we are likely to build quite a bit of descriptive material into any complex demonstrative we use in order to avoid any possible confusion. If a contract writer fails to do this, we may judge her rather harshly for not having done enough. We might even go so far as to claim that the law should act as though reference here failed, regardless of whether or not the relevant interpreters managed to track the right objects. On the other hand, when the benefit of success are high but the cost of failure low, as in our Hail Mary cases, it seems as though we may be willing to employ extremely low standards when judging whether someone has done enough. Well, this is the one where this people speak only French and other people speak only English, and I'm not sure what the referent is. Like the person screaming at them will not communicate the specific danger, but they will communicate the danger, and that sort of minimal thing people understand by screaming. That like demonstrative act will get communicate the meaning well enough. So it's like, yeah, you've done enough, but then again, you're not like to communicate the specific danger is not the goal anymore, and so that reference isn't what's critical. And then at that point, it's a lot simpler if you're not doing a specific reference, and instead of just yelling "run," yeah, it's like you can scream and people know to run. At the very least, we seem loath to judge speakers harshly in such cases, even if they have not done what would have been required to get their point across. Well, what is the point? Yeah. If doing enough to ensure communication with the demonstrative really is this context sensitive, then we can imagine a friend of the ideal listener theory attempting to rehabilitate the theory by saying something similar. What it means to be ideal is relative to a certain set of interests we have in asking about what a term refers to. This would entail a fairly radical thinking of the metasemantic project, making it far more interest relative than most have taken it to be to this point, more like the sort of deeply contextual metasemantic that Travis, 96, proposes, but it might also serve to make the view more plausible. To be clear, we do not mean to be endorsing such a view. Nonetheless, if one is drawn to the sorts of motivations that have led many to think that ideal listeners will have a significant role to play in a theory of meaning, then we take this to be an idea worth considering. Okie doke. I'm actually mostly with these authors. I don't think the idea. I think they're this is basically a very long takedown paper of the ideal listener theory. Is mostly on point here. I have bits and pieces of problems as we were going along the way, but nothing like their overall whole sort of like argument against the ideal listener theory is, like, I guess you could say, substantial. But I mean, you can, as I was kind of doing along the way, I'm not sure, like, even just this beginning one, that's the bastard who's trying to cut my pension, and the question is like intersect different objects. Fine tailored jacket or hand finished shirt. I mean, it just sort of blows my mind. What is this? Inline note? Like the idea that you're going to somehow mistake a shirt for a bastard. Like there's feels like there's more going on right there. And so if you're trying to find out how an idealized listener would figure this out, like in sort of mistake a shirt for a person, when you made a specific reference to a person, when you're talking about that, like in this area here, I don't know if, yeah, that this part here, when this is the thing that would discount it being a shirt, seems a little bit missing the point here. Now the question is, now of course you need someone who is a competent speaker of English to know that a bastard is not a shirt. So am I using the some sort of ideal theory of this? Again, I'm thinking just the mutual understanding of the word bastard when pointing at only a scene with a person in it, only one person, and no other and only other non-person things. That would just be enough to localize it, what that's about, because there's only one person there, and so that fixes that in that scene to all the peoples. Okay, especially, yeah. So, this just sort of thing got me wrong-footed right to begin with, but this is, but like I said, these are outside the target of the paper, and therefore really not that problematic for the authors. Otherwise, it was well argued. I mean, they broke up their things between like luck and specialization, and different kinds of knowledge, like knowing how and knowing that, like being able to figure out which trail is a sort of a visual discerning problem, and with the rocks and things like that. So these are some interesting examples too. Okay, so that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this. Please let me know if you have any questions or suggestions for things to read. Excuse me. And stay safe, everybody, and I'll be back tomorrow. Have a good night.